This is a true story. Back over the summer, I was at this neighborhood tag sale. Huge thing, went on for blocks and blocks. I'm walking down the street, checking out all the different vendors, and I hear this voice behind me. It yells out, "Hey, big man, you need Thor's hammer. Come on, check it out, man." And I turned around, and I'm just expecting some BS. And there's this middle-aged guy standing in front of a table full of random junk. And he's like, "Come on, man, you need Thor's hammer. Come check it out." And I looked at it, and I was like, come on, that's just, an antique joiner's mallet. I'll just take a look at that real quick. And I gave it the once over, and immediately I was like, this is actually something. This is Scottish, maybe English pattern joiner's mallet, old, probably, 100 years old, maybe more. And it feels fantastic in the hand, and just from looking at it, I can tell it's got a whole bunch of little design details that I've never seen before. So here's a real piece of woodworking history that also feels fantastic and has a whole bunch of fascinating little mysteries in it. And the guy says to me, $5, it's yours for only $5. And I'm like, all of this for $5? There's only one response to that. Will you take $3? So for years, I've been using this. This is the Paul Sellers joiner's mallet, and I made it from his video. And it's really an excellent tool. It's sturdy, comfortable, and not too difficult to make. I've even used this in professional cabinet shops, and it's served me really well. But the second I picked up this mallet, I felt like something was just really different. For one thing, it's much more comfortable, more rounded, easier on the hand. The other thing is when I use the Sellers mallet, I feel like there's a lot of leverage in using it. I really have to swing it, and there's a lot more handle than I necessarily need. And that's all part of the original design. But when I use this mallet, it feels completely different. It feels like there's just this, chunk of mass just sitting up above my hand. And rather than swing it, I can just sort of let it drop. And it delivers just monster hits with very little effort on my part. Whoever designed this thing just understood a lot about geometry, much more than I understand. Now, it also has some really interesting construction details. We'll go back to the Sellers mallet for a second. It comes apart, which is handy, and you can see that this handle is actually wedged. It's wider at the top and narrower at the bottom. And that makes perfect sense, because when you're at the client's house and you're using it and you're chiseling away, you don't want to swing back for a big hit, have the mallet head go flying off the handle and, through the client's window. That sort of thing is bad for business. So this wedged shape, this makes a lot of sense. This one is also wedged, but in the opposite direction. It's narrow on top and fat on the bottom. And even though there's a little additional wedge up here, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That should be a loose head that wants to fly off, especially over decades and decades of seasonal changes in use. But it's easy to tell that it hasn't. You can just look at the patina on the tool. It's totally flush right here, no lines down here. This mallet head has never moved, which is really interesting. The head is also aggressively curved. I've never seen this much curvature on a head. And then, let me get in close here. Right at the top of the handle, you can see this little circular detail on both sides. It's beautifully executed. It makes the tool look really nice, but it's more than that. When you get in there to grip it, it just lets you feel exactly where the flats on the sides of the head are, and it makes it incredibly comfortable right up here on the top. I've never seen a detail like this before. In fact, most of the details on this mallet I've never seen before. So it's a really comfortable, ergonomic tool filled with fascinating woodworking mysteries. Clearly, we have got to build one. Let's get after it. I want a hard and tough wood for my mallet head, so I'm breaking out this log of Osage orange. Processing stock from firewood can be a huge time waster, so I'm going straight for the hatchet. I'm going to use this tool for as long as possible before switching to planes. So I concentrate on keeping a loose grip and a light, easy stroke. I'm not just shaping the billet into something roughly square, I'm also removing all the sapwood and revealing that bright yellow heartwood. With the rough shaping completed, it's time to cut off the section that I'm actually going to use. I start off with the DeWalt saw that I use in all of my Woodwork for Humans videos. But this Osage wood is more than a match for this cheap big box tool. I need to break out the big guns here. So I get my big old Diston crosscut saw so that I can get this cut finished before the video is over. The rough billet looks good, and now I can start refining it. I use a wooden foreplane and a pair of winding sticks to establish one flat face. And then I reference a square off that face to plane the adjacent edge flat and true. With two good edges, I can gauge straight lines and bring the last two rough sides into final dimensions. You can see me referencing my gauge directly off the original mallet. I'm making a copy, so there's no reason to measure with a ruler. Of course, I'll put all the exact measurements in the plans, and you can grab those down in the description. Now my billet is much too wide, so I jump back to the hatchet to waste away some material. I think a lot of woodworkers see this as a camping tool, but if you're working by hand, you cannot dismiss the efficiency of an axe or a hatchet. I get close to my line, and then I can quickly just finish up with a plane. And here's where the project hits a snag. The billet looks square and solid, but if you look closely at the end grain, you'll see this little check that happened when the wood was green, before I sealed it. I thought it was tiny, but you can see it running all the way down the side. For a tool that's going to get hit over and over again, a flaw like this is a disaster. This billet is not salvageable. Luckily, I have a big chunk of dry, white ash that's been sitting in my shop for years. I know it's stable, so I immediately start transferring the measurements off the old head. You can see me walking in and out of frame here as I dimension the new head on the bandsaw. There's just no time for me to do another one totally by hand. But this ash is clean and straight grained, and in no time, I can move on to the handle, which is probably the most challenging part of the piece. Anytime you're making a mallet, I recommend you start by making sure the head and the handle fit nicely together, and saving all of your shaping for later. For this piece, I'm copying the strange double-tapered tenon of the original. So I lay out lines with a ruler, and then just plane down to them. Once the wedge shape is made, I copy it onto the mallet head. This way, I have some layout lines to follow as I'm chopping the mortise. For a really deep mortise like this, it makes sense to bore out the waste, so I'll go in from both sides, using a smaller bit on top and a larger one underneath. After the waste is removed, it's on to some straightforward chiseling. Anytime I do a mortise with the center drilled out, I still go straight across the work, as if the hole wasn't even there. Some people will chisel along all four sides of the mortise, but I find that leads to inaccuracies. Making a series of cuts straight across lets the width of the chisel determine the finished width of the mortise. It's a very precise way of working. Now you want really crisp edges at the top of your mortise, but don't forget that this hole tapers in both directions. Get your edges defined, and then use your layout lines to lean your chisel and get that correct angle. You don't have to nail it on the first shot. We'll be trimming that mortise in a second. Personally, I never get a good fit right off the jump. My handle doesn't even go all the way through, and it is gappy as hell. The good news is that looking through the mortise instantly shows the places where my edges aren't as square and where I need to trim. There's a lot of ways to trim a mortise, but I really like grabbing the mallet head in the vise and using this controlled, two-handed chisel technique to pare the sides and maintain a flat edge. If you're frustrated with your mortise, and I got frustrated with this one a couple times, try using the edge of your chisel as a straight edge. Lay it along the inside edge, and see if it'll wobble like I'm showing here. Notice that if I rotate the head 90 degrees and do the same thing, the chisel is flush along both the edges and stays steady. This tells me that the wider cheeks of the mortise are already flat, but that the narrow ends are still high in the middle, and they need work. Now, I have a very heavy vintage vise, and it's sturdy enough for mortising. But if your vise is more light duty, or if your piece is slipping when you hit it, you can clamp a piece of stock into the vise and then screw clamp your mallet to that piece of stock. With this setup, you have the full support of your bench underneath the piece and the holding power of the vise to keep it from wandering around as you chop. I don't have to use this setup, but I often use it anyway, just for its stability and convenience. After a couple of rounds of trimming and testing the fit, my handle is starting to fit the mortise, and I'm getting an idea of why this goofy tenon even works. That double taper might seem like it's going in the wrong direction, but it seats very tightly inside the head. I actually have to tap it out to get it to release, and I'm not even done getting the fit. Oh, and you don't need a mallet to make a mallet. If you don't already own a wooden one, I recommend one of these auto body hammers. They make great temporary chisel mallets, and they're such good general tools that I keep this one under my bench all the time. With the head and handle fitting accurately, it's time to start shaping those big curves on the head. I've laid the lower curve out on my piece of ash, and I'll define the lowest part of that curve with a stopped saw cut. Then I can take out the waist with a series of bevel down, scooping chisel cuts. I've got a whole video on doing curves with just a chisel and saw, so I'll let you watch that if you want to learn about this process. But I do need to mention this middle section around the mortise. If I come right over the edge of that hole with the same chisel cut, the unsupported grain on the edge of the mortise is going to break out really badly. But you just need to think ahead a little bit. If you come in with a coping saw and undercut the fibers along those edges, that should make it safe to finish chiseling the curves. You can see on this first cut how I get close to my edge and then carefully lift the chip with the edge of my chisel to make sure it's going to come up cleanly. Honestly, this part of the mallet is still a mystery to me. Did the original maker chop the mortise and then cut the curve? It seems like an awful lot of trouble and risk. On the other hand, if he shaped the bottom of the head first, he'd be laying out a mortise on a curved surface, and that sounds like a total nightmare. I'm really not sure how he did it, but the little bit of detective work is definitely part of what makes this project so much fun. With the rough shaping done, you can wrap a piece of sandpaper around a spray can and fair the curves in with an easy circular motion. What I'm not going to do is cheat and use the radius at the top of my belt sander to finish it up. I am not walking off camera to the machine, I am not coming back covered in dust, and I am not wearing a respirator. You can't judge me. Now, I'm going to cross-cut my ends to their final length and give them a bit of an angle. The two faces of the original mallet have slightly different slopes, but they average out to about 7 inches. Pretty much every mallet you see has angled faces on both sides, and if you're new to woodworking, that might not make a ton of sense. But as soon as you start hitting it with a chisel, you immediately understand what's going on. This angled face means you don't have to swing the mallet nearly as far to get a good hit on the chisel. It helps protect your wrist from overextending. And you could angle these a lot more if you wanted to and pick up more ergonomic advantage, but keeping them a little bit more up and down, that has another advantage. Let's say you're working on a piece and you need to get a chisel squared away, you need to get something set up over here. Well, you can take a mallet like this and set it down on the edge of a countertop, and because the face is close to perpendicular, it'll balance on that face with the handle sticking out really conveniently. You can get everything set up over here. Maybe you have a chisel and you need to make a hit. You don't want to take your eyes off that chisel. You can just reach over by feel, find that mallet handle. It automatically registers in your hand so you know the head is pointing in the right direction, and then you can go up and strike your work. This design just has so many advantages. We have to have it in our piece. This back saw isn't deep enough to saw all the way through, but that's easy to handle by just rotating the piece. You can see me struggling a little bit to get through this tough ash with such a fine-toothed saw. But when the waste comes away, you can also see how relatively clean the surface is. The minimal cleanup makes it worth the extra trouble for me. A sharp smoothing plane with a freshly lubricated sole smooths out that face, no problem. You don't need any fancy low-angle plane to tackle this tough end grain if you have a well-set tool and you use a smooth, circular stroke. As I work, you can see the pale, torn grain of the saw marks being slowly replaced by the shiny and dark grain of cleanly sliced fibers. And if this step gives you any trouble, try using medium grit sandpaper on a block to get your surface. I finished mine up this way, and it worked great. Now, the last interesting detail of this mallet is this little curved section right here. It sits proud of the handle, and it's a perfect little radius. And right from when I bought the mallet, I was super curious about what's going on with these. But the second you get your hand up in there, you feel what's going on. They let you know where the head is, and they're just extremely comfortable, especially for this thumb and forefinger grip that you're likely to use when you're doing delicate work. When I wanted to make the mallet, the first thought I had was, well, how did the original craftsman lay these out? Because that's close quarters in there. And I immediately had an idea for this. I thought, well, I bet you could just take a coin and put it in there. And I dropped in a regular old American penny, and it's perfect. It gives me the exact spacing from the head to the bottom of the curve and the exact radius. So I got a penny in place on my handle stock and traced around it with a marking knife. And that gave me everything I needed to get this detail laid out and start cutting it. And I'll admit, cutting these details might be the trickiest part of the whole project. And I'd even leave them out, except they feel amazing in the hand and they look really cool. I chose white oak for my handle, and it's a perfect handle material, but it's also chippy and difficult to carve. So I've given myself a stop cut, and you can see me coming in with controlled, bevel-up cuts all around that radius. Once I've got the shape pretty well defined, I use a rat tail file to smooth things out. I can tell from the tool marks on the original mallet that the maker did all of his carving with chisels, but he was working in beech, which is a smooth carving wood. A different material demands different techniques. You have to be willing to experiment and adapt, even in hand tool woodworking. There's no reason to be a slave to tradition. Once these details are cut, I shape the handle using my homemade spoke shave that I made a couple of weeks ago. Of course, I have a whole drawer full of good vintage spoke shaves, but I honestly like this one. It's really light, and the wood sole glides so smoothly against the work. The handle on the original mallet is very rounded. It's kind of a long teardrop shape. I can't see any tool marks on the original, so I have to assume that the maker sanded or rasped the final surface. This sanding stick that I'm using is made from a scrap of square aluminum tube. It's really flat and rigid, and it helps me quickly get a smooth and finished surface. I'm also finishing up the round details at the top of the handle with sandpaper wrapped around a magic marker. At this stage, I'm not so concerned with getting crisp lines. I'm much more focused on getting a smooth finish that will be friendly to the hand. I've radiused the top of the mallet to match the underside, and my sanding stick fares those curves really effectively. To finish off my mallet head, I'm going to chamfer every edge. These details aren't aesthetic. When you have a striking tool, any sharp edge is vulnerable to splintering. Chamfers protect those brittle corners. And you might wonder why I'm hand planing wearing a respirator. Well, it's because there's still sanding dust in the air from sanding the mallet head. I have asthma, so I'm really careful about not breathing dust. Assembly for this mallet is really quick. First, I cut a slit in the top of the handle, and then I put glue on the tenon, set it in the head, seat the fit against my bench, and then I can use glue and a scrap of walnut to wedge the top. When all that's finished, I don't even need to wait for the glue to dry. This mallet's ready to use. Here's the original, and here's the copy. And you can tell just by looking at them, the copy is very faithful to the original. I got all the details and the general shape really great. And as soon as you get this tool in your hand, the design of the tool itself tells you how to use it. So when you grab it down here where the handle is thick, that's your power stroke. That's where you're going to deliver a big hit when you're wasting away material. Choke up a tiny bit on that handle, and then you have a more delicate grip. And that's for if you're doing something smaller, like chiseling out the mortise for a hinge. But there's one more grip. If you put your index finger flat along here, and your thumb along here, well, I'd call that your carving grip. This isn't a carving mallet, but if you just have to do a little bit of detail work on something, this mallet, with its curved head and this special detail on the handle, that's going to let you get that work done without having to carry a second mallet in your toolbox. Now, this channel specializes in easy projects for the woodworker who's getting started. But I have to be honest, this was not easy. This was a pretty complex project, and it took me a whole day of shop work to get it done. Now, if you need a mallet, don't buy a commercial one, make your own. I've got several videos on how to make easy and effective mallets. I will link to those down in the description. But even more importantly, if you don't have a mallet yet, build the Paul Sellers mallet. This is a fantastic tool. Paul has a great video, link in description, and this is approachable for a beginner. It's just not very difficult. This is the first one I made, and it came out good enough to use on the first shot, so it's highly recommended. But if you've already got a mallet, if you've already made a mallet, and you're ready to step up to something a little bit better, well, allow me to suggest the Cadillac. I must own a dozen mallets, and this one is better than all of them. If you need something really fine and you want to make it yourself, I highly recommend this. I have a set of plans available on my website, very reasonably priced. You can grab those at rexkruger.com/store. Before I go, I always have to thank my patrons. My patrons are the people who are giving me the support to go on crazy archaeological tool hunts and chase down tiny little details, spend days in the shop experimenting and figuring out the little things, packaging it all up in a nice little video and bringing it to you, the internet, for free. It's not free to them, because they help pay for it, which is good, because it's not free to me. I got expenses. And my patrons on Patreon are making this a viable job for me. Can't even say how grateful I am. If you'd like to be one of those people, go on over to patreon.com/rexkruger and check out the early access and rewards that I have just for my patrons. And to everybody who's watching, I wouldn't be down here at all if I didn't have viewers. Thank you so much for watching.